Welcome to Negotiation. That's right, the podcast where we delve deep into the art and science of negotiation. I'm your host Abhi Mohorsan, and today we are exploring a high stakes negotiations scenario involving three tech giants: Apple, Samsung, and Qualcomm. We have already talked a little about this and presented a short introduction what happened between these giant companies in earlier weeks. The first episode is unmasking ethics in negotiation. In this episode, unmasking ethics in negotiation, we'll dissect the ethical dilemmas and choices each company faced. So let's get started. For the first segment, let's talk about Apple's ethical reasoning. Apple, a company renowned for its innovation and commitment to quality, often finds itself at ethical crossroads. On one significant ethical issues for Apple in this negotiation is balancing competitive advantage with play, fair play. Apple has been criticized for using its significant market power to negotiate lower prices, sometimes at the expense of suppliers' margin. The question arises: is it ethical for Apple to leverage its dominance to squeeze suppliers, or uh, or does its responsibility to shareholders justify this approach? Apple's action often sparked debates about the fine line between assertive negotiation and exploitative practices. Alright, that's enough to make think. Now let's go to the second segment that is Samsung's ethical reasoning. Samsung Samsung plays a dual role as both a competitor and supplier to Apple. The ethical complexity here is multifaceted. On the other hand, Samsung must maintain its competitive edge in the smartphone market, which sometimes involves aggressive pricing and marketing strategies against Apple. On the other hand, as a supplier, Samsung must ensure fair and transparent dealings with Apple to maintain a stable business relationship. Samsung challenges lies in balancing these competing interests without compromising ethical standards. The ethical questions for Samsung is whether it can fairly compete with Apple while still being a reliable supplier. Now talking about the segment 3, Qualcomm's ethical reasoning. Of course, so Qualcomm's ethical dilemmas revolve around its patent license practices. The company holds essential patents for cellular technology, giving it considerable negotiating power. Qualcomm has faced legal challenges over its licensing fees, accused of anti-competitive practices. Ethically, Qualcomm must navigate the thin line between justifying its patent fees and avoiding monopolistic behavior. The dilemma here is whether Qualcomm's licensing fees are fair compensation for its innovation or if they are an exploitation of its market position. Now, talking about the conclusion. The conclusion that I make for the first episode is unmasking ethics in negotiation is that ethical reasoning in negotiation is complex and multifaceted, especially in scenarios involving major corporations like Apple, Samsung, and Qualcomm. Each company's action and decisions reflect their values and strategic priorities, but also raise important ethical questions. Stay tuned for our next episode where we will dive into the perception and biases influencing these negotiations. Now let's begin with the second episode, biases enabled. Welcome back to Negotiation. That's right, I'm your host Avi Mahajan, and in this episode, Biases Enabled, we are going to explore how Apple, Samsung, and Qualcomm perceive each other and the impact of biases on the negotiation. Let's dive in. For the very first segment, let's talk about Apple's perception and biases. Apple's perception of Samsung is colored by their intense rivalry. This competitive bias can lead to stereotyping, where Apple views Samsung primarily as a competitor rather than potentially ally in certain supply chain aspects. Similarly, Apple might exhibit a hello world effect towards Qualcomm, seeing them as critical technology partner despite ongoing legal battles over patent fields. This selective perception can shape Apple's negotiation strategy, sometimes overlooking potential collaborative opportunities with Samsung or underestimating Qualcomm's negotiating power. For segment, for second segment, let's talk about Samsung's perception and biases. Samsung's dual role complicates its perception of Apple. There is a tendency for projection biases, where Samsung might assume Apple's aggressive competitive strategy mirror their own. This can lead to a defensive negotiation stance. Samsung might also play selective perception by focusing on Apple's competitive traits rather than recognizing the benefits of their supplier relationship. This bias can hinder open communication and mutually beneficial agreements. Lastly, for the third segment, which is Qualcomm's perception and biases, Qualcomm's perception of both Apple and Samsung is influenced by its role as a patent holder and technology provider. Qualcomm might exhibit a halo effect, viewing its technological superiority as justifications for high licensing fees. This can lead to an underestimation of Apple's and Samsung's willingness to challenge these fees legally. Qualcomm might also fall into the trap of selective perception, focusing on its innovations and contributions while overlooking the grievances of its clients. The conclusion that I make from this episode is perception and biases plays significant role in shaping negotiations, strategies, and outcomes. Understanding and mitigating these biases can lead to more effective and ethical negotiations. Join us in the next episode as we unravel how each party frames the negotiation issues and the impact of these framings on the outcomes. Now, talking about the episode 3, Framing the Drama. Welcome to the final episode of Negotiation. That's right, I'm your host, Avi Mahajan. In this episode, Framing the Drama, we will explore how Apple, Samsung, and Qualcomm frame their negotiation issues and the implications of these frames on the negotiation process. Let's begin. So, for the very uh, first segment, let's discuss about Apple's the issues framing. Apple frame its negotiation issues primarily around cost and quality. For Apple, the core negotiation issues with Qualcomm is the high patent licensing fees, which it frames as unfair and unexcessive. Apple's strategy is to cast Qualcomm as a monopolist exploiting its market position, thereby justifying legal challenges and aggressive negotiation tactics. This framing helps Apple garner public and legal support but also can escalate conflicts. For the second segment, let's explore Samsung's issues framing. Samsung frames its negotiation issues through the lens of competitive positioning and supply chain stability. When negotiating with Apple, Samsung highlights its value as a reliable supplier while subtly underscoring the competitive tension. With Qualcomm, Samsung frames the issues around the need for reasonable licensing fees to maintain competitive pricing for its products. This dual framing helps Samsung navigate its complex role but can lead to fragmented negotiation strategies. Lastly, for segment 3, let's continue with Qualcomm's issues framing. Qualcomm frames its negotiation issues around the values of its technological innovations and the necessity of fair compensation through licensing fees. Qualcomm positions itself as a pioneer whose innovation drive the entire industry, justifying its high fees. This framing aims to establish a narrative of deservedness and evitability, making it harder for Apple and Samsung to argue for lower fees. However, this can also make Qualcomm appear intransigent and lead to prolonged legal battles. Now, talking about the conclusion for this third episode, framing the issues effectively is crucial in negotiation. The way Apple, Samsung, and Qualcomm define their negotiation plans sets their strategies and impacts the outcome. Effective framing can lead to more productive negotiation, while poor framing can escalate conflicts. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the complex world of high stakes negotiation. I'm Arun Watson, and this has been Negotiation That's Right. Stay tuned for more insights in future episodes.